Welcome, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today for this session at Buforia Live. I'm Ernesto Martinez. I'm the Senior Director for Growth Strategy at PTC. And in this opportunity, I am honored to be sharing the stage with a panel of experts from PTC to talk about the best practices for a successful deployment of augmented reality in the industrial enterprise. Joining us today is Steve Wall, Augmented Reality Technical Sales Fellow, longtime PTC field engineer, has specialized in CAD, PLM, and IoT, in addition to AR. He is a member of PTC's AR Center of Excellence. Cassandra Tanosini, Customer Success Manager, Product Lead for AR. With her knowledge of product features and functionalities, as well as an intimate understanding of customer base, Cassandra is the first level go-to for a regional AR Customer Success Manager community. And Luna Duan, AR Growth Strategy Principal. She leads several AR product growth initiatives with a focus on driving customer retention and engagement through data and insights. Each of our experts represent and has been extensively involved in critical stages of journey that companies go through as they plan, deploy, and scale AR technologies to solve high-value business challenges. In fact, to guide our conversation today, we have prepared an executive framework to help cover the different dimensions that should be considered at each one of these key stages in order to maximize the investment in AR. These dimensions include the strategic, people, and content workflow consideration of this journey. But why don't we go ahead and get started and talk about the planning stage. At the outset of a company's journey with AR, there should be considerable amount of time spent planning on how an AR strategy will be implemented. Proper planning ensures that a strong foundation for success is set and provides direction to all constituents of how they should be involved along the way. Steve, as someone who is deeply involved in the pre-sales process with companies, what do you think is the most important things that they should be thinking about at these beginning stages when considering adopting augmented reality?
Thanks, Ernesto. It's critical that you have an influential executive sponsor. Our most successful customers have executive level internal champions that are accountable for the benefits AR can deliver and are committed to the success of the AR program as part of their overall digital transformation plans. Of course, you will have additional stakeholders in this phase as well, but under the leadership of this executive sponsor, when you have stakeholder alignment, an execution plan, defined use cases and KPIs, you can achieve the value that AR can bring to your organization.
So at this stage, you would say that the real alignment of people, processes, and tools are really the building blocks to a successful AR implementation, right? Cassandra, you are deeply involved with customers. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Ernesto. And as a customer success manager, I've seen it. Those customers who run with a lack of accountability or unclear deployment plans and undefined KPIs, they run the risk of getting stuck in what we call a pilot purgatory. What I mean by that is our customers who see success at an individual site or with a specific team, and that stops there, versus being able to scale out throughout the entire organization. When there's accountability, agreed upon measurable results, and a rollout plan to really make it happen, that real understanding of what's next, it's more likely to lead to a successful organization-wide adoption.
So definitely avoid getting stuck in pilot purgatory is one of those tips that you would suggest. That's a great point. And to that end, Steve, for the people planning aspect of this stage, what are some personas or roles within a company that should be involved early on in this phase?
Earlier, I mentioned you need executive level internal champions. Based on many of my previous planning meetings, that executive sponsor might be a CIO, a CTO, a chief digital officer, an innovation director, engineering VP, or a global training director. Additional team members might be represented by manufacturing, engineering, IT, and training. It's a group of people like this that generate a shared point of view on value and who work together to find an opportunity for the technology across all parts of the business that can benefit from AR. It's an exciting discussion to be a part of, enabling the vision that will realize the tremendous value of AR.
Clearly, I guess the discussion it's certainly around value, and it seems that you really need that buy-in at all levels of the organization from the get-go. And I guess it's critical and really important to ensure that end users will be capable of utilizing the AR tools that are selected So from a content and workflow perspective, is there much that a customer can do in these early stages of planning that will make things easier for them in the long run?
Yes, by thoroughly analyzing the use cases and applications of AR, customers can identify the needed AR content and workflow to support it. When I say AR content, I mean the text, audio, graphics, video, 3D CAD models, and even streaming IoT data that create the AR experiences, whether it's for use as work instructions, training, or service and maintenance materials. Plus, proper planning will help identify additional individuals who have the right set of technical skills to help develop this content. And to your point about end users, you should definitely consider their perspective early to ensure that the AR solution is delivering the expected value.
So I know we will be talking about scaling later on. I just want to jump in here and highlight that it's really important to plan ahead. This is especially relevant as we think about scaling in terms of replicating success from one side to another or from one team to another. You want to document your workflow, your content, those then build into your best practices, go into your center of excellence as you scale further down the road.
That's actually a great point. Thanks, Luna, for that perspective. I think in your role focusing on growth, it is critical to bring this perspective in the early phases with companies. So I think we've captured some of the great tips and considerations for customers who are working through that initial planning phase of an AR strategy. I'd like to move on the conversation to talk about the deployment stage. As companies advance in their journey, getting to this stage of deployment can be both exciting and daunting for most of them. But luckily here at PTC, we have a team of customer success managers that can help our customers really go through each step of that journey. Cassandra, as the AR product lead in our customer success organization, you have a lot of direct contact with companies who have invested in deploying AR. From your perspective, what are some of the best practices for success once a company has moved from that early planning stage to making that formal rollout?
Yeah, sure. So once a plan is in place, success then really relies on both the internal buy-in and user adoption. In order to check those boxes, we zero in on communication and enablement. My number one recommendation is to have a solid and well-communicated change management plan. Part of that plan should include consistent top-down messaging. Leadership should reinforce the why and what value this new technology aims to bring to their workforce. In addition to understanding the value, the workforce should feel enabled and suitably trained, not only to use the technology, but to talk about the technology. Getting users to a point where they're both comfortable and confident is a pro tip for creating change ambassadors on the ground. It's also super important to share the success stories internally. The more your teams interact, share best practices, and work together, the more buy-in you'll generate.
Yeah, totally. That top-down communication Cassandra just highlighted is really important. We actually have a customer example that illustrated this. We have a customer that's a manufacturer for complex machinery for paper converting. They deliver their equipment to customers all over North America. What they are facing is very basically increasing complexity of their machines, and they face inefficient training and high cost of service. When they used before solutions, they were able to cut their service visits to their customers and reduce their documentation and training time. When we look at their success, they were able to do that because they have established buy-in across the company, all the way from their upper management to their line of business executives, IT managers, and even to their customers, to understand why AR was a top priority with the long-term implications. Really helps them establish this common goal among all the participants to deploy AR, which then leads to the interest and momentum that's really critical to ensure proper implementation.
Exactly, right? The entire organization needs to feel ownership of the project. Everyone from the top down must have a stake in the success. You're fundamentally changing the way people work, and having change champions at all levels, including the top, will help with a successful deployment.
So fundamentally, what you're saying is AR is not just a technology, but is really something that is changing the way that business are operating today. And with that, having this core group of champions engaged at all levels of the organization is super important. So it's almost like a task force, if I understand correctly, right? That they should ensure that the program takes off properly and stays on track. So with that in mind, Steve, you spoke earlier about technical skills necessary for the teams involved to have, from creating content, establishing the workflows. Can you quickly touch on some of those skills that people should have or be considering in their teams?
Yeah, let me frame my answer in terms of what the Vuforia Enterprise Suite offers our customers. Our array of solutions across the AR portfolio can meet each customer's distinct needs and make it easier to deploy an end-to-end AR solution for each use case. Our offerings are solution-centric, which provide fast time to value and are built to address specific use cases. We also have platform-centric offerings as well that provide the flexibility to address virtually any use case our customers might find value in. So depending on the solution, there may be little or no technical expertise required, or you may need internal resources with experience in such areas as coding, engineering, 3D CAD, and UI design.
Thanks, Steve. And I would argue, right, not only is user-centric, solution-centric or platform-centric, user-centric seems like that's actually the way to go. And with that in mind, customer, let's say they've done their due diligence in identifying that team of content creators. When it comes to workflow during deployment, what are some recommendations that you make, Cassandra, being deeply involved with customers at this stage?
Yeah, so great question. Something I want to point out is that our customer success organization has compiled some highly recommended best practices through our digital success paths. These are meant to be step-by-step guides available to our customers to follow as they go through their journey with augmented reality. And some of what's captured through these paths are the best practices specific to content and creation workflow. And there are two key tips I want to call out. Number one being the more that gets integrated into the everyday workflow, the stickier the technology becomes. For example, with work instructions, focusing on rolling out libraries of content versus individual assets over time. And I'd say number two is having that user-centric approach. Steve mentioned this earlier. The solution has to work for the end users. It should respond to real pain points that they have. Some of our more successful customers make user testing a requirement and use it to validate the value with them. These activities allow content creators to get direct feedback while also generating that on-the-ground excitement.
Thanks, Cassandra. I think those are two great tips that our customers should really definitely pay attention to or consider as they're doing their deployment of AR. So far we've talked about planning, we've talked about deployment, and I like to move the conversation and talk about scaling. Right? And when we talk about scale, we have to talk about growth. And Luna, since you're very invested in growth, not only to foster Vuforia's AR products within an organization and helping companies really find the value and continue to scale AR across the enterprise, what are your thoughts when people are thinking about scaling? What should they be thinking about?
The first thing I like to bring to the table is that you need to think scaling comes in all shades, right? It's not just the one type of scaling. What we often talk about is, of course, scaling in terms of one use case, one AR solution, scaling to more people, more locations. That is what I call as the vertical scaling. The trigger point for that is you've seen some early success through adoption and value delivery, and you can set some metrics around that. You can define your metric based on some usage threshold that corresponds to certain value attainment. So for example, the number of AR-enabled remote assistance calls that has reduced your travels. If you want some ideas, you can refer to the digital success path materials that Cassandra just mentioned earlier. There are some ideas there for your inspiration. The second type of scaling is what I call as a horizontal scaling. This is the type of scaling that you should keep in mind all the time. When you're thinking about horizontal scaling, the triggers for that is actually there could be some compelling event happening externally, business assumptions that changed, or like you just have shifted priorities, or that would enable some AR use cases to be more useful than others. So with those compelling events, then you take a step back and think about like, how do I reprioritize where I want to go next, and what are becoming more valuable for me to pursue. So COVID, for example, right? It probably led to a lot of disruption in your prior plan, but simultaneously, it also brought great opportunities for accelerating your digital transformation in areas like remote assistance. So take advantage of those. This is why you should keep scaling in mind all the time as part of strategies to adapt to the changing business environment.
Yeah, and I just want to say that's another benefit to working with a dedicated customer success manager. We guide our customers in identifying those opportunities for scale, as Luna mentioned, while maintaining the value targets as defined in the planning stages. Once identified, the CSM will support the new teams and provide them with the resources and best practices that they need to get started and achieving value.
So that's actually a important point. I guess companies, when they start thinking about scaling, will certainly discover that there's gaps in their organization. So leaning into the partners that have that expertise starts becoming more and more critical as you're thinking about scale, right? So as a company then successful, let's assume they complete their first deployment of AR, dedicated to a set of use cases or location. This thought of scaling seems imminent, but that transition might be challenging for many of the companies that we work with. And it may not translate, right? Doing one thing in one site to other sites or to other business cases. It doesn't seem to be a very linear transition. So Luna, how can customers really take what they've learned in their first years of deployment in the scaling scenarios?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's not always linear, and it definitely depends also on the type of scaling you're pursuing. So before rushing into any of action of scaling, you should ask yourself a couple questions. Have my business assumptions changed? Are the current use cases still the most important ones for me to pursue? And then that determines whether you should be pursuing a vertical scaling strategy or horizontal scaling strategy. If it is vertical, then for sure, there's a lot that you could have learned, you have probably already learned from your first success, right? Like what have you learned in terms of the best practices there? How could you most efficiently pass on the knowledge from there to the new groups? Then when it comes to horizontal scaling, this is where you should think about like, what use cases should I go after next? You could do some potential value estimation versus the cost versus the level of efforts and tools, resources required so that you can make the best decision over there.
Yeah, I'd like to bring the focus back to how the initial planning can really help in the long run. When customers properly execute on the initial planning phase of an AR strategy, they identify and prioritize multiple use cases. As Luna has said, they scale through to the next use case and so on, experiencing faster time to value given Cassandra and Luna's great recommendations. As AR is more widely used and adopted during scaling, the Center of Excellence team I'm on routinely re-engages with customers who want to leverage our unique AR expertise. We deliver guidance on best practices and help customers understand new software offerings. All of us on the panel and at PTC share the same common goal to help our customers succeed with AR.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, right? Being at PTC, this customer-centric notion is at top of mind for everybody involved in the organization. And it all comes to full circle, right? Like what you build in that foundational phase of the AR planning stages that we discussed early on ensures a better success in the long run. And just continuing on this topic of scale, trying to wrap up this topic here. If you had to summarize, Luna, what are the key steps that customers must take to begin to scale? Like, what are like your top 3 things?
Sure, great question. And here is the 30-second version of the scaling playbook. So there are 3 key steps. The first one is assessment. Second step is the strategy. And third step is implementation considerations. So for the first step under assessment, this is where we should be thinking about the AR use cases, revisiting them, reevaluating your business assumptions. And where possible, you can leverage the support from our digital transformation group or Center of Excellence, that the group that Steve is part of, to help you. The second step, strategy, this is where you make the decision on should you go for vertical versus horizontal scaling or some sort of combination of both. You could run a cost-benefit analysis of your options and start with the low-hanging fruits. Step 3, implementation considerations, specifically on people, content, and workflow. On the people side, it's important to get a leadership buy-in and stakeholders. We cannot stress this enough. It's super important making sure you have everyone on board, and then address the gaps for user skill sets, because ultimately adoption is key. Appointed project leaders to pilot the new use cases and help you manage the further rollout. On the content and workflow side, try to reuse prior AR content and processes where possible so that you can reduce the barriers over there and set up your center of excellence to facilitate the knowledge transfer. If your plan is to address new use cases with new AR solutions, this is where you go back in full circle. Go back to that planning stage that Steve had shared earlier. Same considerations that he had called out still applies here. Try to anticipate the requirements on the content workflow with your end users in mind. So recap, assess your situation, strategize, vertical or horizontal, and keep the considerations for people, content, workflow in mind as you implement.
Thank you, Luna. Well, there you have it, right? 3 key steps that cannot be missed as people are thinking of scaling. And thank you, Cassandra and Steve, for your great insights throughout our conversation. We're getting close to the Q&A section here, so I'll start wrapping up. So for companies that are considering to bring augmented reality into their digital transformation plan, or have already made the investment and are going through this deployment journey, or perhaps even scaling, the thoughts that you guys have shared here today with our audience, they should prove to be very valuable. As I think we've learned today, the involvement of the key teams from the executive champions all the way down to the deployment individuals is critical throughout the planning, deployment, and scale phases of the journey that we described throughout our conversation. So furthermore, companies that acknowledge some of their own gaps and they want to learn more about AR technologies and that, how can they really transform their industry, should lean on trusted partners during this AR journey, because companies that have shown to lean in these partners have proven to yield amazing results, despite some of the challenges that this new technology can bring or they can face on the way. In the next few minutes, I'd like to open up the conversation to our audience and share some of the comments and questions they have with our panelists. So let me look here at the Q&A section and we'll see. So here's the first question coming up, and it's on the planning phase. When a company is in the planning phase of a new AR strategy, how do I choose the right devices for my organization? The topic of devices, right? You cannot be missed. It's not just the software, but the delivery mechanism. So
yeah,
I guess this
I'll take that one. Sure. It's actually a lot easier than you think. When I mentioned that we thoroughly analyzed the use cases, part of that is asking a lot of questions about where you're going to experience the augmented reality. And so obviously a wearable will be front and center if you need hands-free, for example. But simply, our viewer runs on phones, tablets, and Microsoft HoloLens, soon to be Magic Leap, and the RealWear and Vuzix devices as well. So you just simply start designing your AR experience for those devices. And you don't even have to always target those devices, since everybody has a phone or a tablet at the ready. You can design your AR experiences quickly and start iterating on just the content and how it looks, and then migrate over to one of the wearables. It's a lot easier than you think.
Thanks, Steve. And I have a question here around use cases. What are some of the ways that I can ensure that my program is focused on the right use case? How do we evaluate options between, horizontal, vertical applications? So I guess this is a question for open up. So who would like to take that one?
I can take that. So,
great.
Identifying and outlining challenges in your business that your business is actually facing is critical. Right? Consider existing issues that prevent your organization from achieving its goals. Prioritize your list of business challenges. Keeping business value top of mind will help give you the direction for the right use case. I talked earlier about addressing real pain points, and I know Steve did too. And this is also critical to having a good understanding of, how do I decide on a use case before, moving forward with a real strategy. Plugging in a solution where there's no problem will make adoption near impossible, so it won't be a good use case.
Great. And I think I had a second part to that question, and I guess it goes to describing the differences between horizontal and vertical scaling. So Luna, you talked about that. Do you mind sharing the differences once again for our audience?
Yeah, sure. So here the assumption is like we've already passed some of the milestones around the adoption that Cassandra covered, right? And then we're at a point we've seen success, early success, and we can go either to more use cases, and that is the horizontal scaling, where we can go deeper into the same use case, but like applying it to more sites, more people. So that is a vertical scaling. The key difference here is that basically, are you pursuing new use cases? Are you trying out the new AR solutions to address those?
Great. Okay, there's another question here that I thought it was very interesting. What are some of the ways that companies that have chosen that right use case, they evaluate their success in deploying AR technology? And I think this comes from companies that maybe have limited resources and they want to have the initial successes before jumping all in AR. So who wants to take that one?
Yeah, I can talk about it. So we're talking about evaluating a project, right?
Right.
And like with any project, it's key to evaluate how it went. Take the time to reflect on the project with the project team, the content creators, and end users. Explore questions like, did we achieve the solution or the outcome that we were intended to reach? What went well? What was challenging? What were the benefits of using this technology versus previous methods? Revisit the goals and metrics as defined in the planning phases. Compare your baseline metrics to current data and determine how much of the solution has provided so far. And then share these results with your stakeholders so they're informed of the value of the overall project. So, looking back at baseline metrics, looking back at, the initial problem statement, and then being sure to share out those readouts with the key stakeholders.
Great. And I guess this is related, right, for companies that want to have an introduction to AR. We have a question here is like, maybe testing something like Chalk seems like a good intro to convince everybody from top to down level across all areas of the organization of the benefits of AR. Would that be something that you suggest? I guess this is like a tip of the spear type of scenario. Luna, you've been very involved in Chalk, right? What would you answer to that?
Yeah, definitely starting with something like that is easy to prove out the value. I think is very critical, like just thinking in terms of how could you get more buy-in, more resources within an organization to further roll it out. But still, I would stress that like whether that's a really in an area that you need a solution to solve for, it's not just because there is a great solution there, like what are your problems, right? Like I would assume probably you would have some areas where you can apply this, but making sure you identify what teams, for example, what scenarios, what specific, like where in the workflow could you embed this, and making sure those infrastructure is in place for you to see great adoption success, and then leverage that to get further scaling happening. But definitely Chalk is a great starting point. It's going to help you prove that value faster. Yeah.
Awesome. So we've talked a lot about people, right, in this conversation. People planning, teams. I have a question here from one of our members in the audience is, how do you then build a core team to drive the AR along the enterprise? And I guess this can be shared between Steve and Cassandra. So do you guys want to take that one? How do you build that core team?
So I would start by, again, emphasizing the need for that influential executive sponsor. And then as the team assembles, the various representatives come along, and we at PTC will join up with meetings immediately to get that conversation started right away and go through all those planning phases that we talked about, the execution plan, defining the use cases, and setting up the KPIs.
Great. We might have time for one last question, and we can just summarize it. So what are the pitfalls we see in scaling? Just quickly, what are the pitfalls that should be avoided?
I can take that one. I think we covered some of it, but like it's definitely worth just highlighting those. I think there are three things that I would say are common pitfalls we see. The first one is that we're waiting for the perfect moment that we feel like we need to have everything ready to even consider scaling. That perfect moment in your mind may always be disrupted by what's changing in the environment. So you need to stay alert on what's really happening, because then that has implications on your prioritized use cases and where AR could add a lot of value. The second pitfall I would say is not taking enough time to assess. That assessment stage that I mentioned, step one, is really important. Do not skip that, because that helps you to think about where should you prioritize next and help you have the success really almost like you're set up for success. And lastly is like, make sure that you have planned properly. Like that, going back to that planning stage Steve mentioned, have that all those steps laid out before you go into the scaling. Consider all of the implementation related requirements or risks that will help you the long way.
Thank you very much for that, Luna. And thank you once again to our panelists, Cassandra, Steve, Luna, for sharing your insightful thoughts today with our audience. Thank you for tuning in to our dear audience. And we invite you all to continue joining us today here at Before Your Life. See you all soon.